Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1129 continues our journey into what may be the Elbaf arc as we finally break out of this little side quest and get the true identity of this fake sun god, and it's much more interesting than you might think. Not only that, but we get a ton of moments for the Straw Hats to shine and get a very cool development for Luffy's abilities that we've actually seen in the series before, and I'll get into all of that and more in this breakdown. So with that said, let's get right into it. We start things off with our 16th entry to Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Circuit pilgrimage cover story as we find Yamato visiting Shinobu and Tama in her home of Amigasa Village as she undergoes her ninja training. Last we saw these two was during Vegapunk's broadcast as they listened in alongside Momonosuke and Kinemon, but it seems Shinobu has reverted to her original appearance after having been withered away from Ryokugyu's Devil Fruit abilities. This is a bit interesting as Raizo had also been put in a similar state after their clash with the Admiral, but he reverted back soon after. I'm not entirely sure why one took longer than the other, but unless this was just an oversight by Oda, I think we can take this to mean that the events of this cover story are actually taking place after the events of the second day of Egghead. Up until this point, it wasn't entirely clear when this cover story was supposed to be relative to the events of the story, but this suggestion that it's taking place after the Egghead arc opens up a lot of possibilities, especially for popular theories involving certain characters approaching Wano with newfound intel. This development also means there's still hope for Queen to regain his plump figure, as he was also withered away last time we saw him. One last thing, Komachiyo is also present here after we last saw him celebrating Wano's freedom alongside Tama, Speed, and Hamlet. I wonder if we'll get to revisit them as well. Now, given that Yamato is already at Amigasa Village, I suspect that we'll hit Udon soon enough, as this is one of the southernmost locations in Kuri. I'm looking forward to whatever comes next, so with that covered, let's get into chapter 1129, Live Dolls. We pick back up with the Sun God entering the Lego City in pursuit of the Straw Hats as we see the Temple Guardians defeated behind him. While we did discuss that the Raven's name is a portmanteau of the names of Odin's two ravens from Norse mythology, we missed the wordplay last week with Hilmengarder. It's a twist on Jormungandr from Norse mythology, but in Japanese, the first part will be pronounced Yoru, which is the word for night. Here, Oda replaced it with the word for day, Hiru, which in English would be read as hill. Now in this chapter, we start to see the cracks in the Sun God's facade as they stumble over their words. As the Straw Hats run away on the back of Iskat, Luffy mentions how he's impressed by the effort that it must have taken to create this world out of blocks and decides to preserve as much as they can. We've seen this side of Luffy before, as he's shown great respect for people who devote themselves to their work. Now despite this, the Sun God has no plans of letting the crew escape, as they mention that this room was made to keep even the likes of giants inside, showing how much he underestimates our heroes, and we'll touch back on this in just a bit. He draws a net from the top of his staff and briefly captures the Straw Hats, but of course, this is useless as Zoro and Sanji make short work of it. It's a bit interesting to me that Sanji is using his Ifrit jump here so liberally in this arc. He had used it for his Epaulet strike alongside Luffy and Zoro just a few chapters ago, while the other two used fairly basic techniques, and here, Zoro simply slashes the net with a single blade. Without necessarily getting into the dregs of power scaling, I wonder if this just means Sanji's Ifrit jump can be used without exerting much effort at this point. This is just the first sign of the crew's development, as they all get to shine in one way or another in this chapter. Now Usopp destroys the mirror on the other side of the room with his pop greens using a technique that was initially called Skull Bomb Grass upon his debut in Fishman Island, but more recently in the English version is referred to as Skull Blast Grass, having seen it used on Egghead against S-Shark most recently. Now it doesn't necessarily break through the wall itself, but I think these slight shortcomings that we've seen from Usopp so far are laying the foundation for his eventual developments as this arc progresses. Nami also gets to show off a bit as she summons a shroud of storm clouds, much to the Sun God's surprise, as it had been established earlier in this chapter that the faux clouds that he created were merely cotton balls that were hung up, really playing into the feel that this is some sort of childlike diorama project. With the power of Zeus, Nami hits the Sun God directly with her lightning blast technique. Now this move is a bit interesting as it was first used by Big Mom as she brought Zeus in the form of a lightning bolt down on Judge during Whole Cake Island. The kanji for this technique, Raite, was translated literally as thunderbolt. Later on, after Nami acquired Zeus, she uses the same technique, though now it's called lightning blast in the English translation, perhaps to differentiate it a bit from Big Mom's move. Here we just see it being used to bring a lightning bolt down on the Sun God, whereas we've also seen it used where Zeus just strikes through an enemy without summoning an overcast. We don't really get the aftermath from him getting hit with this technique, but it goes to show just how capable the crew is at this point in the story. Perhaps the most exciting part though for this chapter, for me at least, was Luffy's use of Gear 4th as a partial transformation. We see him give his arm the properties of Gear 4th Forth bound man without needing to apply it to the rest of his body. Not only that, but he's not even depicted infusing his body with air with the muscle balloon technique. Rather, it seems he's just altering his body structure to take the shape effortlessly, almost like how he's able to in Gear 5th. Now, it could be that he blew air into his thumb off screen, as the anime does often include that sequence in these scenes, but even so, this is quite the development, and it's a bit reminiscent of how Luffy was able to localize Gear 2nd to a single limb post time skip, as he no longer needed to apply it across his whole body like before. It's also quite interesting in the context of Zoan partial transformations. This has never been formalized in the series just yet, but we've had a few characters who were seemingly able to apply their Zoan transformations to specific parts of their bodies. The most notable example of this is Marco, who we often see turn his arms into phoenix wings and his legs into talons. It's never been stated outright if this is supposed to be his hybrid form, or if this just shows that he has a unique mastery over his devil fruit powers. Our first instance of seeing a partial transformation, though, was actually with Lafitte, who similarly to Marco was able to turn his arms into bird wings, though we still don't know just what his devil fruit powers are, or if this is something else entirely. Now, Oda explained in Volume 100's SBS that transformations can be altered, as in the case of Black Maria, whose Zoan transformation allows her to maintain the upper half of her body after using some sort of drug. This is somewhat similar to Chopper being able to access more transformations with his Rumble Balls. Now, the most recent example of a partial transformation may have even been with one of the 5 elders, as Nusura was shown maintaining his upper half of his body as well, giving him a centaur-like state. Whatever is going on with that, I hope we do get some more explanation to the possibilities of Zoans, as there's a lot of potential here. Luffy being able to use partial transformation may also work to explain the quote-unquote mistake from a few chapters ago, where Luffy seemingly used the Gear 3rd technique but called it Gear 4th. However, it should be noted that this was called Elephant Whip, which, despite being a new technique altogether, does use the naming convention for his other Gear 3rd plus armament hockey techniques like Elephant Gun, Elephant Gatling, or Thor Elephant Gun. Due to the nature of Gear 4th, Luffy tends to utilize the power of compression to augment his techniques on top of inflating his limbs as he does with Gear 3rd. Most of these techniques are arm or punch based, with his only technique involving his legs being the Rhino Schneider, which is effectively a drop kick, making use of his elasticity and compression. Because of this, I'm still not 100% sure if Elephant Whip was meant to be a Gear 4th technique or not. Anyways, Luffy makes use of his Gum Gum Kong Gun to bust through the wall, a technique that we first saw used against Doflamingo upon Gear 4th's debut. With this, our crew ends the chapter with a promising future ahead of them as Luffy is wide-eyed in awe. This cliffhanger is very reminiscent of the start of other adventures, such as when the crew made their way to the Reverse Mountain to the Grand Line. I particularly love this focus here on Chopper and Usopp behind Luffy, as they were the 2 crewmates that Luffy had called out for when he first got to the giant ship toward the end of Egghead, knowing that they would appreciate the giants just as much as he does. I also love that while everything has been pointing to us being in Elbaf, it's not outright confirmed just yet. As much as I want to get going with Elbaf, I'd also be happy with the twist of us being somewhere else. After all, Oda did tease in his Jump Fest a message earlier this year about not going to the next island even after the course to Elbaf had been decided upon in the arc. We'll just have to see. Let me know if you think Oda could be pulling the rug here and Beyond This Wall is somewhere else entirely. But we're not done just yet, as I wanted to take some time here to talk about what exactly is going on with this sun god. In this chapter, we get the reveal of this mysterious masked giant, and as it turns out, it's Rodo, or Rodo. For those unacquainted, Rodo is the navigator of the new giant warrior pirates, first shown during the Straw Hat Grand Fleet cover story, but we actually first learned of his existence as far back as Whole Cake Island, as he was one of the children born alongside Loki and Goldberg during Big Mom's flashback. We speculated about the possibility of the sun god being a familiar giant based on the clothing they wore, with their boots and furred pants or leg warmers being very reminiscent of what we saw with Gerd and Rodo in that cover story. But given that Nami and Zoro were both wearing similar clothes, and the fact that those 2 giants were Hiruden's crewmates, it didn't make much sense at all for the sun god to be one of them. That is, until the revelation in this chapter that Rodo had seemingly turned his back on Hiruden after learning that he pledged his allegiance to Luffy. Now for some context, during Big Mom's flashback, we learned that it was Hiruden's dream for the giant warrior pirates to come back, and after the events of Dressrosa, Hiruden revealed that he now dreamt of reviving the crew himself. As such, he pledged himself and his companions to serve under Luffy's Grand Fleet. Now at some point, Hiruden and his allies had ended up working for Buggy's pirate mercenary operation, and in order to serve under Luffy and become a pirate crew of their own, Hiruden announced to Buggy that they quit, which we saw the aftermath of this later during the Grand Fleet cover story, and it's there that we were formally introduced to the rest of the new giant warrior pirates, Rodo, Goldberg, Gerd, and Stanson. Now, we met Gert during Big Mom's flashback, and that's when Rodo and Goldberg were first mentioned, but Stanson was actually introduced all the way back during the Sabaody Archipelago arc, as he was the giant that was at the auction. There he spoke of repaying the Straw Hats in the future, and as fate would have it, he would end up becoming part of their grand fleet. Or so we thought, as we learn in this chapter that Rodo despised the idea of being subservient to a mere human, something that his Elbathian pride would not allow, and this makes sense given that Rodo would not have been privy to Luffy's strength at the time, since it was only Hiruden who bore witness to Luffy's abilities in Dressrosa. And he continued to underestimate the now Emperor, as he mentioned how the prison he had created was durable enough to withstand a giant, but as we see at the end of the chapter, Luffy is more than capable of breaking through such defenses. All of this should really just prove to Rodo how capable the Straw Hats were and how wrong he was, but we'll see if his pride continues to get in the way of that. I also wonder if he was alone in refusing to join Hiruden under the Straw Hats, or if the other crewmates decided to refuse as well, though it should be noted that Rodo may be somewhat of a lone wolf in this regard, considering that he was not present alongside Hiruden, Gerd, and Goldberg 22 years ago after the Alhara incident when they went to recover the books. Now, throughout this chapter, Rodo was characterized as a bit of a dork, with perhaps some sort of complex. He's created this country inside a diorama out of children's toys, inhabited by what we can assume to be prisoners, especially given that we see them plotting their escape in this chapter while the Sun God is distracted. Also of note, he calls this place his little walled garden, which is of course a clear reference to where the Straw Hats first met Dory and Brogy. He speaks in an overly dramatic manner and maintains this facade of him being this mysterious eldritch god, and in the English translation, he refers to the Straw Hats as if they're ultra rare characters to collect or unlock, while in the Japanese, he refers to them with an honorific which, to my understanding, plays into his otaku-like nature. In either case, he's really being made out to be this huge nerd. He monologues about this historic drama unfolding in this world of his creation and refers to the events before him as a story. It's not entirely clear if he's playing it up to maintain his appearance before the humans, being forced to live in this place, or if this is actually how he acts when he's alone. Now, we do get some explanation for just how the Straw Hats ended up in this place to begin with, and it may be a bit disappointing for some after all these weeks of speculation. As it turns out, the Thousand Sunny was brought to Rodo by Mugen, which may suggest that this is how the rest of the prisoners in this land arrived as well. I should mention that the scaling in this panel is kinda crazy. According to the Vivre cards, the Thousand Sunny is 56 meters tall and 39 meters long, which means Mugen has to be massive here, and perhaps even bigger than normal giants. For some context, the shortest adult giant is about 12 meters tall, and giants like Hiruden and Dory are around 22 meters, so if Mugen is bigger than the Thousand Sunny, then he would also have to be bigger than normal giants. Of course, Oda has always been pretty inconsistent with portraying the relative sizes and scale of characters, but this does make me wonder if this is what the line from the previous chapter was referring to when they said that this giant seemed especially large. Perhaps Rodo is significantly bigger than the rest of the crew. We'll just have to see. Now, not only were the Straw Hats abducted by some external force and some sort of mistake, we learned that the reason for the crew being knocked out for 2 days was also a bit of a goof, as they seemingly traveled through a stretch of sea with a peculiar weather phenomenon. I had suspected that absinthe was just some sort of red herring, and that there was another reason for them falling asleep for 2 days, especially since it wouldn't make much sense for the giants to get so thrown off by a drink that they consume so casually. But the inclusion of this sleeping mist is a bit peculiar. It is fairly in line with Oda's writing style of creating cliffhangers that are easily resolved or not as big of plot points as we think they will end up being, but it does feel a bit lazy or misplaced. If it's something that has to be traversed through in order to get between Egghead and Elbaf, did the Giant Warrior Pirates just not know about it, or were they able to ignore it and circumvent its effects on their way to Egghead since they seemingly got there in less than a day's time, since Dory and Brogy do cite the newspaper which only reported Luffy's presence on Egghead that morning? All of these questions may simply be irrelevant here, as it may be something that Oda just intends on hand-waving just to get through this part of the story. Whatever the case may be, it looks like Rodo had some even more sleeping gas at his disposal, which gave him enough time to integrate the Straw Hats into his little fantasy world. Interestingly, we only see the original 5 Straw Hats on this table, which follows since they were already inside the Lego City when Chopper was not yet brought in. This does make me wonder though, if Chopper somehow came in at a later time, or if Rodo had only laid out the original crew in this scene. Maybe there's something more going on with that. All in all, this is a pretty fun twist that sets up some form of conflict for the Straw Hats on Elbaf. While Dory, Brogy, and the Giant Warrior Pirates are fond of Luffy and the Straw Hat crew, we're already seeing that not all Elbaf Giants think the same way about our heroes. I wouldn't be surprised if the Straw Hats find more resistance once they get to Elbaf. Well, if they get to Elbaf. Dory and Brogy understood the significance of the Sun God, but given that Rodo was so willing to put on a disguise and embody a fake version, I wonder if there's more giants out there that don't necessarily buy into that whole thing. There are also a ton of potential other conflicts or plot threads that could be brought in, with Zeus being a homie and potentially being recognized as Big Mom's influence, or with the Straw Hats having some alliance with Kid, who just a few days ago was ousted by the Giant Warrior pirate captains. Speaking of, I had been wondering if Kid and his crew could have also been taken in by Rodo and placed in this fake country. There's a lot of fun potential there, with him being imprisoned in a plastic prison and made unable to use his powers, as we've seen with magnetic powered individuals in other media before. I also can't wait to see what the rest of the crew is up to. If they need Elbaf themed clothing, Rodo did have some extra outfits on his table, so maybe we'll end up supplying them with that now that he's seen their true power of the Straw Hats. We'll have to see. That's about it for everything I wanted to talk about in this chapter. Let me know where your head is at in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.